Special thanks to our promotional partners at the American Philatelic Society.
The APS is the largest stamp collecting organization in the world, supporting collectors of any level worldwide.
For more information about membership and APS services, visit stamps.org. I'm Charles Epting from H.R. Harmer in New York City.
And I'm Michael Cortese of Noble Spirit in Pittsfield, New Hampshire.
And this is Conversations with Philatelists. Now, Michael, you probably remember, because this was only like a week ago.
Yeah.
I was on Richard Fragola's message board.
True.
And someone posted about a new book that was coming out like the next day.
Yeah.
And I texted you and I was like, Michael, we got to get this book and we have to get this guy on the podcast.
Yeah.
And you were back and you were like, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
that's exactly how it happened.
And I was going to say, I saw this post within minutes. I'm on his website. I find his email. And Cameron Blevins is the author of
Paper Trails, the U.S. Post and Making of the American West. So it's a new book that just came out a few weeks ago, and it's already back ordered. Like, you can't even get it on Amazon.
And what I love, this is one of these books that is not, again, as much as I love philatelic books, this is one of these books that combines philately with larger historical trends and concepts. I'm partially biased because my favorite college course I took was called The American West, and it was literally just a look at westward expansion and how the church and literature and all these sorts of things played into westward expansion. I'm really disappointed that this book wasn't out yet, because I feel like this would have been a great textbook. This class was offered by the California State Librarian as well, which was awesome to have somebody so knowledgeable. But I feel like he would have loved a book like this. He has unfortunately since passed. But this book that Cameron has written is just an incredible way of making philately matter. It's one thing to get into the weeds of what route a cover took or what date does that postmark say? And a book like this is just so much bigger and really puts everything that we do and we love into context. And I think that's really what's exciting about it.
Yeah, it's a deep dive into the history of the U.S. Post Office and how it shaped westward expansion in America. It's fantastic. Like we said, it's sold out everywhere right now. It's on back order, so we had to order digital copies in order to read the guy's book before we interviewed him.
I'm glad to see this book doing well, and I really can't wait. Let's bring Cameron on.
Hey, Michael and Charles, how are you?
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Looking forward to this.
Yeah.
When I found out about the book, I texted Michael immediately and I was like, we have to try and get him on the podcast. Like, this is, for us, this is as good as it gets. So thank you for taking the time so quickly.
Well, I'm sure I'll probably end up disappointing, but, we'll give it a shot here.
Not at all.
First things first, how has launch week been? How are things going in terms of the reception? And looks like it's sold out, so that's certainly not a bad sign.
It apparently sold out the first day, which is completely staggering to me. I was not expecting that. I think in part, so I had a Twitter thread with a release of like the data set and the kind of animated map, and I think that went a little bit viral on nerd Twitter, which I think fueled a lot of that. So so it's been going really well. It's a little bit crazy. I'm trying to balance that with like teaching and all of that stuff, my normal job. But no, it's really exciting. It's awesome to have it out there. So
that's great. Yeah, and congratulations on the success of it so far. So jumping right into things, what kind of took you down this path? What got you started on this journey here with this book?
Yeah, so I stumbled onto this when I was a graduate student. My first year in graduate school, I was doing a research seminar, which is where you have to write a paper by the end of the semester. And I was really interested in the history of the American West and geography of the Western United States, and was trying to think of ways to map out where people were moving and when. And the problem with that is that we have information from the census on how many people lived in each county, but it's once every 10 years. And in the Western United States, counties are quite large. So knowing that 1,700 people lived in San Bernardino County in California tells you almost nothing, right? It's a massive, massive area. And so I was trying to think of other almost proxies that I could use to map out changes in settlement patterns, and stumbled upon post offices as one idea for doing so. Obviously, a post office being a kind of proxy for a surrounding community. And so I spent the semester at the San Bruno National Archives poring over microfilm, transcribing the years of operations for California Post Office specifically. It took me about 2 or 3 months to do California, and just for about 30 years, it was, just really, really difficult labor. And then wrote a seminar paper, and then came back to that when I started my dissertation. And really, the more I looked at the U.S. postal system, the more I realized that it wasn't just a proxy for settlement, but it was an accelerating force for a lot of these larger changes in the Western United States. And so that was the kind of origins of this, which brought me down this kind of circuitous route. But yeah, it's been a pretty long journey here. So.
One thing that I think is interesting when you look at the American West, if you have a country like England or Germany or France, their borders are very tightly defined. Yeah, there was some colonial expansion, but the U.S. is certainly one of the most prevalent, if not only, places on the planet where the post and the country sort of, you have post office and the borders expanding at a similar rate. So can you talk a little bit about what makes the United States Postal Service unique in terms of being that driving force versus, again, the UK is not going to get any larger because you've got an ocean on all sides. So as the country expanded, again, what is unique in America in terms of the way the post interferes with society?
Yeah, so the U.S. Has a really interesting history, and especially in the 1800s, of this massive territorial expansion in a fairly short period of time, going from effectively a cluster of states on the eastern seaboard to about half a century later, a continental expansion. And there's obviously a lot of factors that go into it, namely, first and foremost, warfare and native dispossession. But the U.S. Post plays this really fascinating role in the United States that is different from places like Great Britain in that it was expansive. It was way larger than any postal system in the world, consistently employing tons of people and operating in many, many more locations than other places. And that was really crucial for this process of territorial expansion, because that meant that a post office could set up shop in really distant places very quickly in a way that didn't happen with other national postal systems. So if you had a mining discovery in the middle of Montana territory, you would have a post office up and running within a matter of months. And what I argue in the book, the kind of process behind this was fairly unique to the US postal system, and that it use what I call the agency model. So rather than what we would be more familiar with today of going to a government building, having a couple of full-time employees who work for the USPS, distributing, mail, or us kind of going to mail packages, something like that. Instead, it looked very different in the 1800s, where the federal government would give a small commission, pay a small commission to a local business owner to distribute letters from, say, their store. And then they would pay a temporary contract with, let's say, a stagecoach company to carry the mail along with passengers and freight to that mining town in Montana. And so the infrastructure that was set up was much more lightweight. It was semi-privatized. There wasn't a ton of central management of it going on. And it was really driven by these towns, communities on the periphery. And that's the mechanism that allowed the Post to really be at the front lines of not just territorial expansion, but then also integrating that distant territory into the rest of the country.
So do you know, in talking about that, do you know if this was some sort of conscious decision that the DC office, the US made, knowing that expansion in this way would allow them to expand into the US West faster and quicker than they could if it was over-regulated?
The short answer is no, and I would say this might be a little bit contested, but after reading a lot of archival material, I'm pretty firmly convinced that no one in DC was sitting there as some kind of grand master plan saying, this is the system we're going to set up that's going to allow us to integrate territory more quickly and on a more widespread scale. What it comes actually back to was when the post office was originally set up, so the 1792 Post Office Act, and really the policy that was concretized into the very origins of the postal system was the idea of universal service. So where it didn't really matter where you were, the US government was going to make sure that you could get your mail. And that's something that has really continued throughout US history. And that dedication to providing mail service to all of these distant places, at first, in 13 states, from Georgia all the way up to, say, Massachusetts. But then as it expanded westward, that then extends out to, again, these really distant mining, timber places out in the western United States. But I don't think it was some kind of conscious decision of this is the way we're going to, become a continent-spanning empire in 50 years. No one had that kind of foresight. It was more an unintended consequence of this commitment to, again, universal mail service.
You said something interesting. I think a lot of people have their image of what going to the post office entails today. It means going to the government building. If it's Christmas time, you wait in line for a long time, and there's a clerk who wants to be somewhere else. And we sort of have it fixed in our mind what the post office is. But, especially, through Michael's and mine's work, we realized that a lot of these post offices were, I don't want to say fly-by-night operations, but they're there for a year or two because the town, the mines dry up and the town disappears. It would have been just maybe a counter in a store or something. Can you talk a little bit about how the experience of going to the post office has changed over the last, say, 175 years?
Absolutely. So it really started for the vast majority of Americans for the first, probably, 150 years of the United States existence. It was much different from what it is today. And that involved the basic idea of you had to go to a post office to both send and receive mail. So prior to rural free delivery, kind of in the early 1900s, most Americans had to walk or ride to the post office, pick up a letter or send a letter. And that meant that they needed a post office. If you have this commitment to universal service, you need a post office fairly close to almost everyone. And that's why there's so many post offices in all these different places. But that also means that you're not going to, as the federal government, buying a building, hiring full-time employees to set up these, shops in a tiny mining town of 200 people doesn't make sense. So this is why this kind of commission and contract system ended up developing, where they're grafting public service onto an existing private infrastructure. But again, there's unintended consequences that come with this. So oftentimes it was a store owner. Your local store owner would be the postmaster. But if you're a store owner, there's an incentive for you to house the post office in your store. It means that everyone around you has to come at regular intervals into your store to check their mail. And that means they're also going to buy some coffee, they're going to buy some nails, right? Rather than buying it at your competitors down the street. And so what you saw, which is just fascinating, is these really intense fights developing all over the country in these communities over who got to be the postmaster and where the post office was located. And at first you look at this and it's really confusing because you're like, this position pays like $30 a year, right? Like, why are these people writing their congressmen back and forth, like newspapers, just like, blah, there's like insane stuff. And you're like, what is going on? And then you realize it's all about, if you control where the post office is located, you're drawing foot traffic into your place of business. So that's one thing. And so the experience of going in to get your mail was very much tied up with a kind of private infrastructure of stores. Maybe it's at a hotel, and also becomes a central gathering place for a community, to agree that it's even more so today. It's still, post offices still can operate that way, oftentimes in rural communities. But especially if you live in a city today, right, you're not necessarily hanging out at the post office in your city. At the time, that's actually was what happened. That's where you traded gossip. That's where you heard news. That's where you met, friends and neighbors. That's where a lot of politics ended up happening. So the post office really was the center of a community, both socially and also in some ways economically. And that's why you saw all these kind of interesting fights develop. And then the other piece of this is that also meant that the post office was really highly wrapped up with politics. And so again, because people cared so much about where the post office was located, who the postmaster was, what you saw was a system of political patronage develop around it, where the executive branch, the postmaster general, is appointed by the president of the United States. And that means that that person has control over who gets to be postmasters in tens of thousands of these communities, which means that person can dole out these positions to party loyalists, right? If you are a Democrat organizer in this mining town, a Democrat comes into power, they're going to kick out the Republican store owner down the street and install you as the postmaster, and then you get the post office in your store, right? So there's all these ways in which local geography ends up kind of filtering up both economically and then also into national politics as well.
That kind of answers a question that I was going to ask later that I had, was what really was their appeal for people becoming a postmaster in their town? Because at one point in the book, you talk about how there was almost this expanse and contraction of postmasters or post offices at the same time, that as many post offices were opening as there were closing. And it almost seemed like there was just this, why were they interested? But to know that it was for kind of to serve the community, but also for ulterior motives to bring people into their stores and everything like that. That makes a lot more sense as to why they were willing to risk this turnover. But
sure,
you also talked about how they would just close almost seemingly out of nowhere. Would that specifically just be for the post offices or the general stores as well? So the post office closing outside of political reasons, postmasters firing people and everything like that, were general stores closing as quickly as post offices?
You know, it's a fascinating question, and it's part of the research that surprised me the most, was finding just the sheer number of post offices that would shut down and then sometimes reopen and then shut down and reopen and then shut down, right? And it was taking place in the span of months, a couple of years, you know, and just it's so different from the conception we have in our heads today of a public institution, a post office, right? There's some kind of stability baked into that system that I was expecting to have in the 1800s that just didn't exist. And that was especially true in the Western United States. And so the short answer is, you know, it was pretty variable from community to community and case to case. But the West was a really unstable region in the United States economically. So a lot of places in the West still do, you know, rely on extractive industry, kind of boom and bust mode of economy. And so you would see mining booms pop up, post offices are coming, but then also, like you mentioned, there's a simultaneous post offices are disappearing as well. I think that speaks to the larger instability of particularly the Western economy, because there is regional differences. New England is much more stable, much fewer post offices are closing in the Northeast, for instance. And you also have fires are like super common. This is another thing that just blew me away, was you can read records of towns and it's like store owner was, quote, burned out, you know, and they were burned down and they'd have to like leave and move. And so I think just the economy itself was super unstable.
When you get into looking at the Post in this period, obviously there's a lot of tropes and stereotypes, and everyone knows about the Pony Express and everybody knows about the stagecoaches. So, you know, you talk a little bit about, you know, your preconceptions about the Post and how those were upended. Were there any other, you know, myths or you know, just misheld conceptions about the way mail was handled or the way the West operated you came across in your research that you were surprised by? Was there anything else that you thought you knew going in, and then as soon as you started digging into the real data, it turned out to not be so?
Well, I just want to say I'm impressed, Charles, that we made it 19 minutes without talking about the Pony Express. I feel like that's usually the first thing that people are like, oh, like the Pony Express, right?
To a lot of people, that is mail. And people don't realize that it was only around for 18 months or whatever. And, you know, you had to be very wealthy to, you know, a $5 letter is the equivalent of like $150 today. So I think for a lot of people, that is mail in the West, without realizing that it was just a tiny not insignificant portion, but certainly not the end all be all.
Yeah, I'm always amazed. The Pony Express is one of the most successful marketing initiatives in American history, right? I mean, the fact that people are still talking about today, lined up to the actual reality of it being an entirely private operation that went bankrupt after 18 months of operating. And I think the thing that surprised a lot of people is it wasn't part of the U.S. postal system, right? It was not any kind of official route. This is just a private venture. And what's really interesting, yeah, sorry, go for it.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I've had an article on the back burner for years now about how popular culture and how especially the James Cruise movie from the 20s contributed to our public misunderstanding of the Pony Express.
Oh yeah, and at some point I was starting to catalog all the pop culture. Like there was like some TV show with I think one of the Baldwin brothers in like the 90s or something, like about like Pony Express boys or something. I have no idea. But even the Pony Express, I think, speaks to this gap between, again, what I think a lot of us have in our minds and the reality, and that the reason the Pony Express was started as a business venture, they knew they were going to lose money. They knew this was not a profitable operation to set up, 100 stagecoach stations or whatever, or excuse me, just stations, and then hundreds of horses, all these riders, right? Phenomenally expensive. But the entire goal was to get a government mail contract. That was what they were aiming for as this private company. And that, I think, speaks to this system of mail transportation in the West that was entirely based on a contract model. Today we have our local delivery people riding around in trucks, right, that are owned and branded by the USPS. And that was not the case at all across most of the Western United States and really most of the country. The vast majority of mail routes were run by private companies. And there's still a lot of contracting that happens today with the USPS, but not nearly to the same degree in terms of the local delivery in the West in the 1800s. And I think the second piece of that as well is that oftentimes we think of this era of Western history as really tied up with the railroad, the expansion of the railroad. And railroad played a huge role in the West. Railroad growth and expansion really shapes Western geography in many ways. But if you look at a map of where people are living, large majority of people in the Western United States are not anywhere close to a railroad line. So that last leg of the journey of, say, a letter from New York, again, out to Idaho territory, that's going to be taking place on a stagecoach. That is not kind of in the back of a mail train. And that's where the system of contracting starts to get really fascinating, where you have, again, stagecoach companies competing with each other for government contracts. And that leads to, the entire chapter in the book that I found really entertaining was this incredibly corrupt system developed in the West, where stagecoach companies were using these fraudulent bidding methods to try to drive down the price so they could get it and then drive up their compensation. I mean, there's a whole scandal that actually broke out in the 1870s and early 1880s around this. And it's tied to effectively, again, coming back to this idea of universal service. How do you provide mail service to a mining camp in the middle of Idaho? And the solution is this contracting model, but that then leads to all these unintended consequences.
Yeah, that led me to another question I had that sparked an idea. Was so many people were hired and fired just through one single letter, one single envelope. Knowing that scandal, everything that you had researched then, were there any other forms of falsified documentation or people who had wanted to be a postmaster and then traveled to an area and mailed a letter from somewhere else so that they got the stamp, dismissing a postmaster or anything kind of not in goodwill like that?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing about trying to study something like corruption or fraud is that inherently people are trying to cover their tracks. So as a historian, it's a little bit hard to find the smoking gun. And when you do, it's really exciting. But there's definitely related to this contracting scandal in the 1870s. So the U.S. postal administrators in Washington, another thing that I found really surprising was that there just wasn't kind of the same workforce that we would expect to oversee such a massive system. And so you had postal inspectors, but there were really, I think there were like 60 or 80 of them total to cover the entire country. And this is not like today where you can fly to Arizona and then rent a car and drive out there, right? Like it's these places are operating kind of on their own. And so a lot of the administration and oversight is being done, as you said, through the mail. And so they're requiring postmasters, for instance, at the end and the start of a route to mail in reports kind of documenting what time the mail arrived, what time it left, like that kind of thing. And so one contractor in particular ended up convincing postmasters to kind of collude with him and then falsify those documents to say that he was providing a level of service that he wasn't. And then using that to lobby the postmaster to give him increased compensation for more service that wasn't actually happening on these routes. And I don't actually have any of those specific falsified documents that I've been able to find. These are more appearing in investigative reports that the government has done. But yeah, it's a really interesting question because, right, the mail is the primary mode of communication for everything in the 1800s. The telegraph is really, really expensive. So that's been termed by one historian, the rich man's mail. But if you were the vast majority of other people, you were not using telegraph to communicate. You were using letters. And so if there was fraud going on and it involved any kind of distance, there was probably going to be letters involved as well. So
you have written this amazing book, but you're also teaching currently. Have you been able to incorporate any of this research into your coursework? And if so, how do students respond to this? Because again, I one of my favorite college courses was on the history of the American West, and we didn't touch on the mail at all. So I'm curious. I would have loved it, obviously, but what sort of reception do you get from students who maybe haven't been exposed to their experience with the post office is very limited in the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting trying to teach students because I think you need to meet them where they are in some ways. I would love to, just like start to lecture about Western expansion and the role of postmasters, but I somehow think they might not necessarily respond to that.
So you'd have Michael and I on the hook.
Yeah, there you go. So if you want to come to Denver, enroll in some classes here, we can just have a two student class. It'll be great. But I will say, I think the main way I've actually used this research in teaching is not so much the content of the historical side of the post office or the West, but I teach in what's called digital history. And so that's using computational methods to study the past. And in my case, it involves mapping out the expansion of the US postal system with a data set of 166,000 post offices, which were collected by a stamp collector, which I'd love to talk about later because this was really key to the work. But that data set has proven actually really useful for teaching students how to use spatial software to map things. It's a really nice historical data set where they can work easily with it. They can understand what it's showing. And then I can also walk through the archival research that went into it because the data set didn't just kind of spring up magically, right? It took years and years and years of labor by the stamp collector looking at microfilmed records to create it. So the data side has actually proven to me, surprisingly, to be much more useful in the classroom than the kind of historical side so far. But I did show my students yesterday. I was on the local news, came out to interview me about the book, and so I showed them like 10 seconds of it, and they were really tickled by that.
Well, you mentioned this research over the top left of my computer screen. I'm looking at our set of the Hellbach books that are essential in our office. And can you talk a little bit about his work that went into this and how you came to find out about this work and how you've incorporated it and built upon it with your own research?
Yeah, the number of times I have just thought to myself, thank God for Richard Hellbach. I owe him so much. And so the backstory behind this is I was a graduate student. Again, I started with this kind of seminar paper. And then as I started the dissertation, I was in the archives doing this whole process of laboriously transcribing when post offices opened, when they closed, what their names were, in an attempt to map them over time. And then about a year into the research, I felt stupid, but I finally stumbled upon Richard Hellbach's incredible works. There's 8 volumes, regionally distributed, of reference books listing out every post office that ever operated in the United States, along with their state their county, and their dates, their years of operation. And at that point, it was 2013. Richard Hellbach had actually passed away in 2011. But very fortunately for me, his wife, Catherine Clark, was still managing the website where he was selling his work on there. So I actually bought the CD of the complete set of Richard Hellbach's post offices for, I think, $80 in 2013. You know, it came in an envelope. I popped in the CD in my computer, and I was just like, this is the jackpot. Like, this is it. Like, this is, I knew immediately because I'd spent a year doing this work and kind of had prototypes what some of this data could show you. To have the entire, you know, history and geography of the United States postal system sitting on your computer screen was really just one of those moments where I was like, this is it. And so I spent the next couple years developing, processing the data, and then doing a process called geocoding, which is taking those records and then trying to figure out where they are on a map. And that's actually a very challenging process to do. And I won't get into all the technical specifics, but eventually I was able to kind of come up with this pipeline to map out where all these post offices were located, and then show the expansion and contraction on a year-to-year basis. And that opened up all sorts of analytical possibilities that are the backbone of the book, really. And none of that would have been possible without Richard Hellbach, right? I wasn't going to spend 20 years collecting all this information about post offices, but he did, and it's incredible work. And actually released the data set last week online, and it's kind of blown up, and people are just thrilled by it. And I've gotten kind of requests from all sorts of other social scientists and academics who want to use it for all sorts of really interesting ways. So his work and Catherine Clark's continued ability to kind of send it out to me was absolutely crucial for this project.
And the other key part of the Richard Hellbach books is the rarity rating for each post office, where it doesn't distinguish between cancellation devices, but it gives you a general rule of thumb where you know that if it's an 8 or a 9, that's more valuable than a 2 or a 3. Is there a way for you to use that data? Is there a correlation between rarity of a post office's markings and the size of the town, or the importance of the town? Have you found out a way to incorporate the Hellbach rarity into the research at all?
I'm really excited because I feel like at this point the conversation is going to transition to me asking you a bunch of questions, because I should have flagged this at the beginning for all your listeners here. I know next to nothing about stamp collecting. I'm a historian first who's fascinated by this history, but I'm pretty ignorant when it comes to this whole world, and I've benefited immensely, obviously, from it. So I guess my question for you is obviously, I know kind of about the stamp rarity index. I've read his documentation for how he came up with that. But how does it work in the field? Are you bringing these to expos and kind of looking how does that work for stamp collectors?
Michael, you want to take it first, and then I'll jump in?
Yeah. Essentially, the people are looking for the cancellation and the specific cancel circular date cancel on these stamps or on these envelopes, letters, covers are rarer than others, I guess essentially based on the scarcity, but more so probably the length of time the post office was open and the number of people it was serving. So you had talked a little bit about when applying to be a local postmaster, they'd have to write in and say how many people are you serving for that town, and that would kind of dictate how many letters are going out, whether they're being picked up 5 times a week, once a week. And things like this, Mr. Hellbach would take into account and create this index of this specific cancel for this specific local postmaster is rarer than this one because more of these went out. And people who collect covers from that time period are going to be looking for that.
It's a popular collecting method, I think more so in the past than today, but people will collect their state or their county, either where they're born or where they live. I would say that there's people who collect, I would say there's at least one collector for each of the 50 states. But I think generally the Western US has always been more popular. Maybe because of, you've got the gold rush, you've got the stagecoaches, there's a lot more to it. Territorial postmarks in particular are very desirable, and can result in big money. And yeah, when if we get a collection of let's say Utah territory or Idaho territory, one of the first things we do is look at all the towns that these letters were sent from. We go to the Hellbach book, and again, if there's a 7, 8, or I think it goes up to 9 in terms of his rankings, that those numbers translate into significant money quite often. So yeah, I think people are moving away from just collecting their county. I think that as with social sciences in general, there's more of a focus on interconnectedness, where if you know what's going on in San Bernardino County, that's not really relevant without knowing what's going on in Riverside and Los Angeles as well. So I think that people are straying away from just a checklist of one of each within their county. But that's still a huge part of this hobby is, the postmarks are quite often, much more significant than the stamps themselves. You can have a cheap common stamp that would have been used in any of 10,000 different post offices, but if it was used at that office that was only open from 1856 to 1858 or whatever, that's a really scarce, desirable item. So that's why the Hellbach, we're looking at these books in a totally different appreciation than you are. But I think that shows how versatile and useful his research is that it can be applied completely differently by different people.
That's absolutely fascinating. And thank you for spelling that out. Because I think, I've always known kind of, that column in the data set and reading his documentation. It's very extensive on that. And I think he terms it, very kind of openly as the most, I think, arbitrary piece of information for a specific post office, right? I mean, he is assigning at the end of the day a subjective score that's based on a lot of these other factors, right? And I think it requires immense knowledge on his end to be able to do that. And so for me, it's always been this kind of piece of the data set that I kind of tried. I thought about it. I was like, oh, well, like maybe I can use that for some way. But I ultimately kind of went back to the idea where, because it is this kind of more, we're not sure exactly what the difference between an 8 versus a 6 is. I think it's highly tied to the length of time a post office operated for. Ultimately, I kind of decided to put that to the side. But I knew in the back of my head, I was like, yeah, this is like the entire reason most people are buying this thing. And for me, it's like, oh, that's interesting.
What's funny too is how skewed and biased the data can be, because if you had somebody writing home to his wife and she kept every letter he sent from this small town, you may have a dozen letters from a post office that was only open for a year versus a post office that was open for 5 years and nobody thought to keep. So there is a lot of human bias that goes into, yes, it's tied to the the duration of the post office and the population of the town, but these things can also be so messed up by just one person who thought to keep a bunch of letters for, a lot of people threw away their clutter, and again, one wife or one daughter or one brother can throw off the survival rates of these things.
And those people are the patron saints of historians everywhere, and probably the bane of stamp collectors, right? It's like, well, we got like 50 of these letters from this post office, so it's actually not that rare, but
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what I assume is what Mr. Hellbach based most of his research on, which you dedicated almost an entire chapter to in your book, which was Walter Nicholson's documenting of the current postal routes as they were happening in real time. And what fascinated me was just how little funding and how understaffed he was. You at one point talk about how his budget for the year was $10,000 and then the budget for twine was $17,000. So why? And then even a decade later, his budget had only moved up to $30,000, and they were a year behind in making these routes and everything. And why was his work so undervalued when it was necessary to figure out for these stagecoaches where they needed to go? They were showing up to post offices that no longer existed to pick up mail that wasn't there.
Yeah, so these maps are absolutely fascinating, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a historian who's really into geography. I mean, they're really incredible cartographic documents, and I've actually talked with a fair number of cartographic historians who are very familiar with them, and they represent a pretty important stage in the history of American cartography. But the background is the position of cartographer, what they called topographer of the post office department, actually goes back a fairly long ways, back to the early 1800s, but then went through this period where there actually wasn't anyone making maps of the postal system, all the way up through when Walter Nicholson was hired by the department from the U.S. Coast Survey, which was one of the big scientific institutions and mapping institutions for the federal government. He's hired during the Civil War in 1863. And it was basically him and a couple map makers there. And like you said, wasn't given a whole lot of funding, and started to make these regional maps where it would be of, a collection of a couple states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, something like that, and trying to map out where are these post offices located and where are the routes that are connecting them? How often is the mail being transmitted between them? And it was really one of the first times that administrators in Washington were actively trying to figure out what is happening on the ground and documenting it cartographically in a really fine-grained way, which again is kind of mind-blowing for us, right? That like you could be administering the postal system and not actually know where a post office was located or how, like where it's in relation to other people. And these all exist on, records that they're transcribing here, but it's not in a map form, which again, to our modern mind, just is kind of like amazing. And Walter Nicholson is the first time where there's an attempt made to figure out what the geography of that system is like. But I think it does also, one of the reasons why, and his maps were incredibly popular, not just amongst administrators working for the postal department. It was, used extensively with the railroad mail service, for instance, but also across the federal government. And so he had documented that he was sending out copies of these maps to Congress people, to other federal agencies, even up to the President of the United States had copies of these postal maps, because oftentimes this was the best source of spatial information that we had for these local distant places, how towns were arranged in relation to one another, and the kind of routes that were connecting them. But the flip side of that is that, as we were talking about before, this system is incredibly unstable. And so especially in these new places in the Western United States, post offices are opening, they're disappearing, the routes between them are changing, the number of times the mail is traveling between them changes all the time. And if you are, the number of times I sat there thinking like these poor map makers in Washington, right? Like trying to track thousands of changes that are happening, every month basically, and like erasing these lines and then drawing new ones in and trying to fix that. So it's this constant process of revision, again, that is very different from what we would think of as a map that is a stable entity of, let's say, Colorado, where I live. Well, that map in a year from now, this was the 1870s, would basically be obsolete. And so they're always playing catch up, trying to figure out where these new offices were, which ones are being discontinued, ones that are changing names. And so to me, what it ended up being for that chapter was really spoke to just how decentralized this system was during this period. There was not a lot of centralized oversight or management of all these changes happening on the periphery. And Nicholson's initiative was one of the few efforts that really did try to document all of that. And even him, is really frustrated by not being able to do so in a timely or accurate manner all the time. And so that became a stand-in for me for really rethinking the ways in which the federal government operated during this period in a very different way from the 20th century.
So another question I had that you had mentioned, you're looking at this from purely a historical standpoint, and we're looking at it from the fascinating philatelic standpoint on our end. We're just fascinated by all this kind of the postal routes and everything. But one of my largest questions was how are these local postmasters acquiring the stamps to sell to their customers that are coming in? So you talk about how they're private contractors and everything like that. Are they buying the stamps ahead of time? It was a little perplexing to me that they would open and close so quickly.
And you can't vet all of these people. You've got a bunch of rogues in the American West who are all of a sudden entrusted with, and the mail to us today is this sacred. You can't open someone's mail; it's a crime. And you're just enlisting all of these thousands of and there's going to be a mixed bag, to say the least. So what was the relationship like with Washington? How did they get the stamps, and was there any sort of oversight into their administration of the post?
So the second question is, was there any oversight? The short answer is no, which is again pretty remarkable. And you have these like letter exchanges back and forth where like someone will be like, hey, you need to make sure that you're, distributing letters more succinctly, and the guy's just like completely ignoring them, and there's no real consequences, right? But in terms of the stamps, so I believe there are regional depositories that people would send both revenue and then I think receive stamps from. And then what would happen was, if that postmaster was replaced by someone else, you would get a letter from the department instructing you to essentially hand over all the official material that you were given as part of this job. So by the 1880s, I believe each postmaster was receiving a postal guide, a kind of rules and regulations they were supposed to follow. Again, didn't actually follow in practice oftentimes. So they would hand that over along with any kind of unused stamps, and I think a couple other different, account books, stuff like that would then go to the postmaster down the street. But there's surprisingly little documentation that I could find, between those connections. There's some back and forth going on. But my impression is, you're appointed, you get, a set of stamps and a manual, and then you're kind of on your own. And oftentimes, for smaller post offices, the vast majority of post offices, your commission, your salary from the government was not a salary. It was based as a percentage of the outgoing mail from your office, the number of stamps that were canceled. And so you would be keeping this account book and then sending in the surplus, but then keeping, whatever it ended up being, like 40% of the revenue that comes in from those stamps. And that's not a ton, right? You're talking, $100 or something like that a year. But yeah, and so there's definitely local, some local archives that have been kept of these account books, or money orders that have originated from offices. One of the big 2 chapters actually in the book really focus on a specific town called North Bloomfield, California, where the postmaster there ended up keeping a lot of these department records, and they're archived at the California State Library. And it's an incredible window into this one local community and how that post office function. And so there's thousands of money order receipts, for instance, documenting, like the names of the people who are sending a $5 money order to Weinstock department store in Sacramento for exactly this much on this day. And so there's super fine-grained information there that I ended up using quite a bit in the book. So
it's an absurd amount of trust that the U.S. government is putting into these people that they previously had no idea who they were, and had to take almost their word on it. Hey, I've opened up a general store. I'd like to be a postmaster. Okay, here's your stamps. And in that day, I mean, some of these stamps, the monetary value in full sheets, I assume, or maybe they were breaking them down, has to be huge. Was there any sort of documentation as to people who would open up fake post offices?
Not quite fake post offices that I've heard of. There were kind of paper post offices, but effectively, so because the compensation again is based on the outgoing mail, there is a kind of mechanism in there for checking. What was fascinating to me was there was actually fairly widespread documentation of people who, let's say, really hated the local store owner, or it was, a Republican community and a Democrat was in charge of the post office, sometimes would go down the road 3 miles to the next town and send their mail from that postmaster to basically stop that person from getting a commission. So and then they're writing to their Congress member complaining, saying like they're not allowed to do this. I mean, so there's all these kind of tips that are happening on a local level there. But yeah, the lack of regulation was kind of staggering. And the other thing, the stamps thing is really interesting. There was also these periods of the ways in which stamps operated as fractional currency, I found really interesting. Essentially, in the Western United States in particular, there's a real lack of money circulating, physical money, paper currency, and in particular, fractional currency, so less than $1, is not really circulating very much in the West. And so people end up using stamps as a kind of shadow currency for, 5 cents for this or something like that. And there's this, like, I don't know if it was a real story or not, but the Postmaster General reported one year that some postmaster in Utah, I think, like bought a house just with stamps or something that he'd like managed to like collect because people were paying him using stamps. So there's a whole interesting connection to kind of financial history as well that I just barely scraped the surface of in the book. So.
Well, my last question for you is: you've come this far without becoming a collector. Have you ever been tempted? Have you ever been bitten by the bug, even if it's just to, collect letters for the contents? Maybe not the stamps themselves, but is there any part of you that is tempted to, dip a toe into this hobby?
So the truthful answer is no. But the big but is that I oftentimes feel like historians often can be like parasites in the sense that we rely on other people collecting stuff for us. So archivists are the classic example where they're collecting all this material that then we're kind of leeching off and using. And in my case, obviously, Richard Hellbach, right? Stamp collector is the basis for a lot of the analysis in this book. But I will say, I think the stamp collecting dimension I've always found really fascinating. And this is common, I think, for historians, not just for kind of relationship to stamp collectors, but also all sorts of other communities that do really, really important in-depth historical research as part of their passion. So you've got genealogy, right? There's a huge number of people doing genealogy, Civil War buffs, railroad buffs, right? There's all these communities of people doing history that are not, trained professional historians, but are producing incredible work. And I think what I've found oftentimes is the really cool part for me is trying to take work that a lot of times for these I think communities are really focused in specifics and details, right? And exactly what year was the stamp canceled and how many people were at this office and where was it located, right? And then connecting that into larger stories and larger processes. And that's been the really cool part for me, is being able to, again, take this incredible research that Richard Hellbach has done and then use it to really explain some bigger insights into what life was like in the late 1800s, what the nature of the federal government was, what was the geography, pace and rate of Western expansion. So again, some of these larger questions that you can kind of tie to these more specific forms of knowledge, I think is really cool. So
this is what I was saying to Michael, actually, in the introduction before you joined us. I said, I think sometimes collectors, myself included, get blinders on and maybe get hyper-focused on something. And a book like yours is really important for collectors to contextualize what it is they're doing and to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and how do these stamps and these postal routes connect to the development of a country like it has over the last 250 years or whatever. So I think that again, even though you're not a collector, you're sort of an honorary collector, and that you help us realize why what we do is even important. You give us a purpose in a way, I think.
Yeah, no, I am, like I said, indebted to the philatelist community professionally and intellectually for the rest of my career here. And I hope the reception will be somewhat positive amongst that community. But I do think, just to kind of revisit that, stamp collecting, I think speaks to, in some ways, what I see as one of the really fascinating parts of the U.S. Post and its history, and that it was this institutional presence that was everywhere. Every single town had a post office. And that's, I think, part maybe of the appeal of stamp collecting, is that you can find these, canceled stamps from everywhere, and figuring out what is rare and, how many things originated from this place, how is it connected to there. And the history of the Post that I found so interesting is that very ubiquitous presence allows you to use it as a window into understanding life during that time. Both at the local level all the way up to the national level. And that's the part of the research that I really kept coming back to, was this connection between, again, these individual letters originating from an individual post office, tying into this national system of information, and then being able to study that system as a whole and the interactions between them, I just find really interesting. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, Cameron, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic. This has been great.
Been incredible. I thoroughly enjoyed this. This has been fascinating, and thank you for this book. That again, Michael and I have been discussing. The last week has been us bouncing back and forth about the book. So to be able to talk to you is a real pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. And obviously, I've really enjoyed talking to you. And thanks for humoring me and shedding some light on various stamp collecting practices here. And I should say that the book is currently back ordered. I think it was a little more popular than perhaps my publisher was expecting it to be. I'm guessing in part because of philatelists, but you can order it on Oxford University Press or on Amazon, and there should be more copies coming in later this month. So.
Perfect.
Fantastic. We'll put links in the description and everything so that everyone can easily grab a copy.
Yeah, and you can. Good. I ordered a physical copy, but it didn't get here in time, so I had to buy a digital copy as well, just to make sure.
This is just a scheme to sell more books, I think.
So you can get it digitally as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Right. Bye-bye.
Michael, I thought that was fantastic. This book, I don't know what to say other than just go buy it. If it's still out of stock, go buy a digital copy and then pre-order. Get on a waiting list for a physical copy. Because the research that Cameron's doing, I think, is just so important, and I love that he touched on it at the end. That stamp collectors are, on the one hand, the reason that a lot of this information still exists. It's sort of a two-way street where he's using the work of stamp collectors, and now it's on stamp collectors to read this book and understand the bigger picture about why our hobby is so important. The first thing every stamp collector is asked is, why do you collect stamps? Yeah. And how great is it to be able to have read a book like this? And I feel like your answer becomes much more, impassioned and its significance. So I thoroughly not only that, but
what I love about this is it stamp collectors are always looking for an excuse to collect more things. So you read this book and it just makes you want to dive deeper into individual postmarks or maybe collect your county or anything. Like it opens your eyes to just how vast and how chaotic the post office was in the West in the late 1800s. And it's a fascinating book. It was just a fantastic read.
And for me to listen to somebody who's not a collector themselves get so excited and have so much information at his fingertips about about this hobby, that was just one of the most enjoyable interviews we've done since we started this whole thing. That was just what more can you say? It was fantastic. I can't thank Cameron enough.
Yeah, that was great. And he responded to us when you reached out to him. He responded so quickly. He was just so on board to.
I feel like again we've got to make him an honorary stamp collector. Yeah. Like we've got his contributions to the hobby are such. Like I feel like he's one of us, even if he's looking at it from a completely different angle.
Yeah. Great book. In the description or show notes, we'll have links to the physical copy, digital copy.
Yes.
I really strongly recommend this book. It was fantastic.
Paper Trails. Go check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Charles, no, this was good. I'll talk to you soon.
Let's also tell people where they can listen. This is on YouTube.
That's great.
It's on Spotify, Apple Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. We're at philatelypodcast.com, philatelypodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, if you enjoyed it as much as we did, because for me, this is a big one. So thank you to Cameron. Thank you to everyone who's listening. Michael, I'll talk to you real soon.
Yeah. See you next time. Thanks.
Sounds good.
Bye.